So we'll start by setting our motivation. So, as we've done, we recollect that the material of the Course comes from the sutra teachings of the Buddha. And the purpose of condensing the essence of the sutra teachings into the Lamrim is to provide a reliable and repeatable method to move in a step-by-step way toward enlightenment, to gain the same meditative insights, realizations that the Buddha possessed, that were responsible for transforming his mind from ordinary mind into enlightened mind. And that this process has been used for thousands of years to create Buddhas. So we develop confidence that if we apply ourselves, we will get that result. And then we think that the purpose of that result isn't for one's benefit alone, but primarily to have the ability to be of perfect benefit to sentient beings. So we cultivate these minds of confidence and bodhicitta as our motivation for the Course. All right. So with that motivation, we'll turn back to the material. We started on Thursday, we started with the second major topic on precious human rebirth. And we covered the first two contemplations on why it's important to study this topic, what the benefits of studying this topic are. And then we began to look at the first of several of the freedoms, the negative states, the detrimental conditions that would not support spiritual growth and development, things that we do not currently experience, things that we are free from, at least right now. And so that was starting with the hell realm. We've made our way through the hell realm. We're going to continue to look at the other lower, what are called the lower realms. Lower meaning lower in relation to the human realm, and meaning that the suffering that is experienced is greater than what even can be experienced in the human realm, that there's no suffering in the human realm that matches the suffering that you find in the lower realms for one reason or another, depending on which realm you're talking about. Okay, So we are day 67. Bless you.
Ooh.
Better turn your microphone off, Kodo.
So, like I said, we're on day 67, and we've now moved into the hungry ghost realm. And the quote is, "Hungry ghosts can't practice morality or generosity. They would literally kill for a scrap of food." So Lama Zopa starts by saying the second freedom, because again, we're in the freedoms, is not having been born as a hungry ghost, whose main sufferings are hunger and thirst, caused by miserliness and desire. Although they also have many other forms of suffering. So if you look at the hell realm, which we just covered, generally speaking, the karmic causes of the hell realm are the most intense kinds of negativity. Things like torture, murder. In Buddhism, they really don't use the word murder, because murder implies a non-justifiable homicide, which is over against a justifiable homicide. And in Buddhism, you only really find the word killing. So, because in Buddhism there is no justifiable killing. There is no killing that's not a negative karma. There's killing that's more understandable, killing that's more reasonable than other killing, but there is no killing that is a completely non-negative karma, at least for an ordinary sentient being who is still under the influence of self-grasping and self-cherishing. Even to kill kind of spontaneously in self-defense. If someone breaks into your home in the middle of the night, even that is negative karma. It's comparatively a much less negative karma than going out and stalking someone and abducting them and so on. That's much, much worse. But we are not off the hook, unlike the legal system. We are not off the hook for any kind of, because karma is not a moralistic framework. It is a framework of what energy is present in the mind at the time that an action is engaged in. And when you take a life, even to preserve your own life, in that moment, you've decided that your life is of greater importance than their life. And so we can't say that that's free from any negative karmic consequence. But when I say murder, I would assume perhaps even if that kind of killing wasn't purified, because karma expands over time. So I would think, even though it's lighter, it of course would still need to be purified. And if not, it certainly, I think, could ripen in the hell, in a hell realm rebirth. But broadly speaking, the hell realm rebirths are karmically the heavier negative karmas, as opposed to, as Lama Zopa just said, the hungry ghost rebirth. The karmic causes of that are more so greediness, miserliness, really, really strong, desirous attachment energy. So kind of a mentality of hoarding, a mentality of being unwilling to be in any way charitable, being completely ungenerous. Those sorts of energies could ripen as a hungry ghost rebirth. And this is also a realm there you find stories, or you could say people relating experiences where they have the ability to perceive this realm, but like the hell realm, it's often, it's not a realm that we observe. Unlike the animal realm, which is also a lower realm, that realm, we do observe. Um, but broadly speaking, we have no access to the hungry ghost realm. And when he says other, so hunger, like he says, hunger and thirst are the predominant sufferings. They also talk about meaning that these, I mean, we of course are afflicted with hunger and thirst every day, but we are able to do something about that. As broadly, most people, at least most of the time, are able to do something about that. And if they don't, then they pass away. If they can't, then yes, they suffer for a period, but that suffering would end in death in the human realm. That's not true of the hungry ghost realm. That suffering is just ongoing. It doesn't, it's not a short-term sort of thing that can cause the end of that rebirth. It characterizes the existence in that rebirth. And they describe broadly that the bodies of that, they're kind of tormented by the actual form that they take, that they their actual the ways in which they would get sustenance are not actually large enough to ingest anything. So they have this hunger and this thirst, but maybe sometimes they can get really tiny drops of water, that sort of thing. But their bodies are set up in such a way that they experience this incredible hunger and thirst, but they're unable to actually reduce the experience of hunger and thirst. And again, it doesn't end there. Yes, Coda.
Please finish.
No, I was just, I don't think we had anything important to say.
If the hell and then the hungry ghosts and other realms are this ongoing, non-stop suffering, how do we get out of them to be reborn somewhere else? Thank you.
Yeah, all of these lifetimes, they do come to an end. You do experience a death in all of these realms, but it's not the same as it is in the human realm. So for example, so the lifetimes in these realms, in these two realms, the lifetimes are incredibly long, eons and eons long. So regardless of what happens during those eons and eons, the causes of that rebirth don't run out, which is just a very different set of circumstances compared to the human realm, where there comes a point where the body gives out, where you can only accept so much suffering, and then it has to end because our bodies are just different. These are more, it seems to me, I mean, I don't know. It seems when you compare them to the human realm, it's almost like they're more energetic in a way, that because they talk about particularly in the hell realms, where there are deaths that occur, but then there's a regeneration that can also happen. So you undergo the suffering of being impaled or being, burned, but then that body is able to regenerate, and then it happens again.
Great.
So in a way, it doesn't seem. It just seems like a very different set of circumstances.
Venerable, talking about killing karma, it's my understanding that historically, Tibet, a large part of the population of Tibet were pastoral animal husbandry. That's how they survived. Well, obviously, they were constantly killing animals. Now, was there some particular way to deal with that karma? And how does a society that's based on killing have a spirituality that's based on non-killing?
Mm-hmm. So it's one thing that's true is that I don't know a great deal about Tibetan society in the 1800s, 1700s, 1900s. I just don't. The things that I do know, or that I believe, I think I maybe I think I might know, is of course, for one, when you look at the teachings that come from the Buddha, there is still a difference karmically between taking the life of a human being and taking the life of a non-human being. Karmically, they're not exactly, they're not the same. And karma can be purified. So if a person is in a life or death situation, and the killing is with animals, then that karma on an ongoing, as long as there's a sense of deep regret, there's, because again, karma is not morality, it's not, it's the energy that's present in the mind. So if it's truly only out of necessity, then there are ways to purify karma so that it doesn't, you create the karma, but you are able to prevent it from ripening. It's also true, as I understand it, that there was broadly, as much as possible, an effort made to eat the yaks and the things, that died from natural causes. They would prioritize that as much as they reasonably could. So there was certainly an effort made in that regard. And then it's also true that over time, an industry in Tibet developed where non-Buddhists were the ones that were primarily engaged in the actual process of slaughtering animals. So the Buddhists depended upon the non-Buddhists doing it, but just like in our society, most people are purchasing dead animals, but not killing. They're providing the economic incentive, but they're not directly engaged. So that also, it's the karma of that is debated by different, but it's certainly different than the karma of killing, because it isn't different if you take a live animal to someone and you say, please end the life of this live animal so that I can eat it. That is the karma of killing, because you observed a live animal, you engaged in an action to end its life. But if you are simply paying the wages of someone who they themselves have decided to observe live animals and engage in an action to take their lives, what that karma is, like I say, it's debated. It's certainly not a virtuous karma. but we can't call it the karma of killing, because the karma of killing requires observing a living being and engaging in an action that ends the life of that living being, not simply participating in the economic incentive for someone else to make that decision with regard, because they're free to choose not to engage in that profession. You are creating a profession in the culture, but people are free to choose whether or not to participate in that profession. So it is true that that industry, I believe it was mainly Hindus, that served that role over time. So that's also.
Well, to a certain extent, it's hypocritical of me to even question, because I eat meat. I don't eat a lot of meat, but I eat meat. However, it has always seemed to me, it seems like it's worse karma to purchase that meat from somebody else who has killed the animal and has killed it because of the demand that you are creating. It has always seemed to me like it would be less of a karmic debt to consciously kill the animal that you're going to consume and consume it. And having said that, that's a question. I'm not making any kind of a concrete statement. It's just how it's always seemed to me.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I would say that if a person has a higher degree of like stability of mind, and they maybe they are able to, they have some control over their delusions, and they don't have sufficient food, because there's also attachment energy. I mean, there's other kinds of delusions that are arising if a person has other things that they can eat. There's also, it's not just, it's not necessarily a necessity, but so there's other things. But so I think it's true that if a person feels like, I have control over my mind, I can engage in this action with a very stable, calm mind, maybe while engaging in prayers for the benefit of the animal, and then continuing to do prayers, afterward, and really then, and they recognize that another person who is doing it because it's their job, they're doing it, maybe they're constantly surrounded by like the noise of the animals, and they have like resentment toward their job, and they're really, their minds are kind of really afflicted, and so they, out of compassion, out of love and compassion, they want to relieve that person from that, because they know that when they engage in the action of killing, their delusions are really strong. Then, I mean, of course, they can't know for sure, but they're presuming on the kind of reasonable basis that that's probably the case. Then I think, it's a better to do it that way. But all things being equal, in terms of uncontrolled mind and all of that, then because karma, again, it's critical to distinguish the Buddhist understanding of karma versus our kind of sense of rights and responsibilities and morality and ethics. It's a totally different framework, karma does not attach unless a person, even if you see, even if two people are in front of you and you have animosity toward one person and you try to kill one person and you end up killing the person next to them because you had no negativity toward that person, that they were a stranger to you, maybe, or maybe they were a loved one. Maybe, you had someone you didn't like right next to someone you did like, and you did care for and you wanted to protect, and you totally accidentally, from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, you are just as culpable because you recklessly engaged in an action. But karmically speaking, the two situations are very different because you had absolutely no intent to take the life of, we can't say that there's no negativity at all, but the two situations, had you killed the person that you hated, the karma of that would have been so much stronger than the karma that does attach to the mind when you accidentally, the other person got in the way, what have you, you missed, and you took the life of someone that you care deeply for. So, which is not, that there's no corollary to that in our understanding of social rights or obligations or ethics or morality, because it's only talking about the energy that's present in the mind during the engaging of an action. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so that might be, there's just the one on the hungry ghost realm. Yeah, so we're meant to kind of try to develop an aversion to those karmic causes so that we make an effort to notice the arising of miserliness in the mind, or the impulse to hoard, the impulse, I'll try to oppose those impulses so that we don't give rise to that karma. So then day 68, we're moving up to the animal realm. So there's different ways of thinking about, as I mentioned, they're all called the lower realms because they're comparatively worse than the human realm, but there are different ways of thinking about which is actually worse, like what is actually worse, because the karmic causes get progressively more difficult as you go lower, which means that, for example, the animal realm is the easiest then karmically to create the causes for rebirth in. So and we can look, but of course, then they say that the number of beings also gets progressively smaller. So then it's also true that the most number of beings. So we also have to consider the lifetimes, the length of the lifetimes in the different realms. And in the animal realms, the lifetimes range from a few seconds, to a few days, up to, maybe 100 years if you're a tortoise, or, I don't know, a whale or something. So they're, in a way comparable to the human realm in that respect, but the karmic causes of creating an animal realm rebirth are easier than are the hungry ghost realm or the hell realms, but the lifetimes get longer in those realms. So the total number of beings can still be greater because they just, once they're there, they stay there for incredibly longer periods of time, whereas the animal realm is kind of turning over much more rapidly. But creating many animal realm rebirths is relatively easy to do. So you kind of have to think about there's different ways of thinking about that. So the suffering, there's different ways of thinking about the suffering of the animal realm. One way is sort of the overt, the lack of ability to avoid anything happening in the environment. So you can't escape, difficulty escaping fires or floods or earthquakes, anything like that that's happening in the environment, you're just sort of subject to. And then, of course, hot and cold, and the constant fear of predation, the constant search for food. There's a lot of those kinds of overt sufferings, but they say that the most intense ongoing suffering, because there are also animals that are relatively like dogs and cats, that are relatively well taken care of. But even in that kind of rebirth, they say that there's a pervasive dullness to the mind. There's a pervasive, compared to the human realm. And this seems to be memories that great meditators have of taking rebirth in that realm. They say that the dullness that you would experience, if you could compare it then to what you're used to, the kind of sharpness of the mind that you're used to experiencing, they would say that you would just be like really freaked out, really kind of terrified of having that kind of experience, because it's like being trapped in a body that is where the mind is just fear and hunger and no sort of penetrating insight into anything. It's just a profound dullness compared to the human realm. And then of course, the disadvantage, of course, isn't, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Please finish.
So the main disadvantage, isn't necessarily that, of course, the main disadvantage in all of these realms is that there's no hope for any kind of study or practice, but no way of intentionally cultivating the mind. But I would say that particularly that's the main disadvantage, because because we don't know what's actually happening in the mind of a rabbit or a dog or a cat. It looks like it's they're fed and watered and bathed and looks kind of nice, but there's just no capacity. They certainly have the seed of compassion. We can see that they show compassion for their children and their offspring, and even sometimes in extraordinary cases, for other kinds of animals. But we also don't know is that an ordinary animal or not? We don't know, because there's tales in the Jataka tales. The Buddha took rebirth in the animal realm as a bodhisattva, and so we don't know necessarily that an animal is an animal, but we can say that there are no animals that are meditating on universal love and compassion, which we can do. Coda.
So, do we humans, when we take good care of our pets or wild animals, like make sure the birds and the coyotes and whoever out there has water and food and wild cats and so on, do we gain merit? Is that helpful? It's good to help them, isn't it?
So there's certainly, well, I mean, I think in one way, I mean, it's not something that I have studied from an ecological perspective. I've heard that there are some ways in which animals might become dependent on certain interventions that are being done, and then if those are removed, then it can cause harm. So, ecologically, I don't know. That's not to say that if we come across a specific individual circumstance that we shouldn't intervene. I don't know necessarily about going out of the way to create an artificial kind of intervention that we're making stable with respect to a wild ecological system, because then we might move or we might die, and then the absence of that artificial intervention. There's certainly examples, I think, of that have been problematic. So that's, I think if you come across a specific individual animal that needs help, then there's, of course, I would say, even if it's not unsafe, then we certainly should render aid as best we can. I'm not, and of course with our pets and so on, of course you don't want to neglect. From the Buddhist perspective, the greatest kind of benefit that we can render to animals really is prayer, really is to play mantra, to help the animals in whatever way we can gain some imprint in their mind of spirituality, meaning, which is limited, of course, but the things that they see, the things that they hear, they do have sight, they do have hearing, and so what is in their visual field, what is in their auditory field, does create an imprint in the mind, just like it does for us. They don't understand it in an intellectual way, but there is still, perhaps they might, because of those imprints, if they do get a human rebirth, or if and or when they get a human rebirth, it could be that those imprints could steer them in a positive direction, in the sense that maybe they might see that same sort of thing or hear that same sort of thing and not know why it feels familiar, not know why they gravitate in that direction. But gravitating in that direction might help them study and practice and so on. And then, of course, there are enlightened beings that are working to benefit sentient beings and helping to create a connection between specific sentient beings and those enlightened beings through the power of prayer. is beneficial, because otherwise there is certainly some benefit in protecting sentient beings from danger and prolonging their lives, but still they die, still that life comes to an end. And so it's the imprints that we, to some degree, could play a role in helping them to create that's of the greatest possible benefit. How much of a benefit, I don't know, because they are animals and they're not able to comprehend. So the imprint is different, but it is the best we can do. So that could be, playing mantra when we're not home, it could be playing mantra as we go for a walk, if it's not going to disturb, if we're walking in nature, playing mantra on the phone for the benefit of all of the birds and things, and playing mantra, of course, for our pets, helping our pet, circumambulating stupas with our pets, showing them our altar, every day, picking them up and showing them the altar every day, showing them the holy objects, having holy objects in other places where they will see them, blessing their food and their water with mantra, things like that we can do. There's a whole bunch of, you can go on to Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive and type in benefiting animals, and there's all kinds of resources that are available for benefiting animals that are on Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive.
I have a little question left over. Like, we humans are taking over the planet, and our greed and our attachment, and we need a bigger house, etc. We're just neglecting all the other animals, just wiping them out because of our greed. So I'm trying to find, like, taking care of them, not over taking care of them, but providing water in the wild or in the yard where I am, and bird seed, and maybe, we have a lot of feral cats here, so I mean, isn't it okay? I'll start playing mantras to them. Thank you. It's just like a heart connection with them. I don't know. It's hard. Okay, Buddhist perspective. I'll try to get it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so now the last thing that we'll contemplate today. Now we've moved into the upper realm, which is still disadvantageous from this perspective, even though comparatively we can no longer say that there's more suffering. There's actually less suffering, overt suffering, overt physical or mental distress. Compared to the human realm, there's less of that in the upper realm, but which makes the disadvantageousness more difficult to see, because it looks like, oh, I would like some of that. But the same disadvantage of the inability to apply oneself to sustained spiritual growth and development is also what characterizes that experience. It's kind of like the Goldilocks story, where the suffering has to be just right in order for us to be spurred on to practice. In the lower realms, the suffering is too great for us to practice. we are too oppressed. The bodies of those beings are, and minds then subsequently are too oppressed by suffering to engage in practice. But in the upper realm, their minds are too distracted by the enjoyments that are available in those realms, the complete lack of suffering. So they themselves don't really experience suffering, and they don't observe suffering, because even for us, there's, we certainly suffer to some degree, but we also observe greater suffering in the world, which can also be a cause for opening our hearts and wanting to grow in love and compassion. But if you don't even observe greater suffering, then that's also an obstacle. And that's what's characterizing this experience. So from the perspective of the purpose of life being engaging in the practices that will free a person from suffering completely, then this is still a waste of time. That kind of experience, it serves no purpose. We can say that the suffering of the lower realms serves no purpose other than to exhaust negative karma. Certainly that's a kind of useful purpose that it serves. It burns off negative karma at least, but we don't learn from it. We don't, like in the human realm, when we touch a hot stove, that of course that did serve the karmic cause of burning off that particular negative karma that ripened at that moment, which is good. And also, though, we can learn, oh, stoves are hot, I need to not do that again. Whereas the suffering of the lower realms, that purpose is gone, because there's no continuity of identity, no continuity of memory. And there's no better option. The hell, and just like if you're born, if you're lucky, you'll be born as an herbivore and you won't have the impulse to kill. But if you're born as a carnivore, and then you have claws and you have fangs, and you have no choice but to engage in the karma of killing again and again and again. You can't make a better choice. So we have a relative freedom in the human realm to learn from our mistakes and make better choices and purify negative karma. And in the upper realm, even though, and so in one way, then it works in reverse in the upper realm, because those beings are actually burning off positive karma, because you can't get to the upper realms. Unfortunately, the karmic causes of the upper realms is also not random. It's not. It's actually good karma, positive, virtuous karma. That, because karma itself is not spiritual in nature, it is if you dedicate it. If when you've created, which is why dedicating is so important. One reason why it's so important. When a virtuous karma is intentionally created, to dedicate it in a virtuous way, so that it can't actually ripen as a rebirth in the upper realm. We don't want a rebirth in the upper realm, because a rebirth in the upper realm serves no useful purpose. And in fact, it serves a negative purpose, in that the positive karmic stores that we did create, that were in the mind, are being used up to sustain that experience. Just like they are, if a person wins the lottery as a human, if they don't do anything useful I mean, it would be wonderful if they won the lottery and then they used that to support all kinds of beneficial things, hopefully some of which would be spiritual in nature and not just, but even orphanages and, that's all still virtuous karma if they're really doing it because they're motivated by suffering and they want to alleviate suffering. It's a more limited understanding of suffering, but still, it's virtuous. It's not negative. But a person could win the lottery and then just blow all of that on silly things, on cars and, mansions and, clothes, not completely wasting that opportunity to engage in virtue with what they've done. And then, of course, that karma also, had it been dedicated better, maybe it would have ripened as, a rebirth in a place where there were a lot of spiritual practitioners, rather than just winning it wouldn't have ripened in that way at all had it been dedicated, more appropriately. It ripened as a beneficial circumstance because it's a positive karma, and that's what positive karma does. But it didn't ripen in any kind of super useful way because it wasn't dedicated toward ripening in a super useful way. I can't say more about dedication in the sense that I don't know. I assume at least to some degree, because broadly speaking, they talk about the benefit of, calm abiding, the benefit of, or at least higher levels of concentration, in terms of the power of prayer, the power of our meditation. So I assume that plays a role in how effectively the act of dedicating actually turns out. But still, it's better to do it than to not do it. To just skip it entirely is not as good as intentionally making an effort. But all of the nuanced causes and conditions that I can't speak to because I just don't know. But yeah, so we want to think about we want to develop a fear of the upper realms that's just as great as the fear of the lower realms, because not only do we spend an incredibly long, because here again, the lifetimes are incredibly long, eons and eons, rather than the animal realm, which can be really brief. The lifetimes are eons and eons, and for all of that time, the stores of positive virtuous karma are being expended to sustain that experience. And then you have nowhere else to go but down. I mean, maybe you get another, because the human realm is comparatively down, but so is the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm, and you've just burned off eons and eons of positive karma. So there's no other. So I mean, certainly you could get a human rebirth, which would be good, but also could be lower than that, which not so good. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
I've got in my notes here that the hungry ghost is about miserliness and attachment. The animals are about ignorance. And the hell realm, is that our anger that throws us back into the hell? What emotion is that?
It's it's generally the most intense. So typically typically when you think about the most intense karmas, typically they're going to be motivated by hatred, as you're saying. When you kill, when you torture, when you, those are going to be generally motivated by hatred. And then attachment energy is going to be, the karmas that are associated with attachment energy are going to be the hungry ghost realm. And then because of the dullness of the animal realm, they say that ignorance is the of the three root delusions, but ignorance of, of what, because everything that we do, until we directly perceive the nature of reality, everything that we do is characterized by ignorance to some degree. But then there's also, willful disregard for, like using our better judgment. That's also, a form of ignorance. Like if, like, oh, I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to shut down. Kind of like when we, sort of the cognitive dissonance of kind of knowing better and choosing poorly. That's also kind of a form of ignorance where we kind of know the right thing to do, but we just don't want. It's like it's more difficult, or we don't want to, and we sort of choose to go down not so good of a route. Is also kind of the energy of ignorance in that way. It's a shutting off of our wisdom, either intentionally or unintentionally. Unintentionally, by that I mean that to some degree we have no choice because our wisdom is limited. But when we do have some wisdom and we intentionally turn it off because it seems inconvenient or it seems less fun, then that also is a kind of karmic cause. And then for the upper realms, it's really, but it's any kind of virtuous. It's generosity, it's ethics, it's the same sorts of things. But again, not dedicated in a spiritual, not specifically a spiritual kind, just kind of ordinary, like kind of just being nice, kind of just being kind, being not that it's specifically geared or dedicated toward a spiritual goal, but just sort of the normal positive things that we go about doing. So we are out of that, and that'll be the last thing that we contemplate.
Venerable,
Yeah.
I would imagine that unless we're really conscious of those times when we're doing positive things and dedicate each time, does it make sense to finish your day with that kind of a contemplation that you dedicate all merit and all good virtue to all sentient beings, and that kind of covers it?
Yeah, they say, I mean, just like it's never too late to make some effort to purify a negative karma, it's also never too late to try to make some effort to dedicate a positive karma. It's in both cases, it is also better, comparatively, relatively speaking, to do it immediately, to do it as soon as you do a negative karma, best choice to purify it right then. Second best choice to do it as soon as you have time and space and you can recall. But we learned about purification decades after we were born. So, of course, for many negative karmas that we didn't have any opportunity or thought, maybe we regretted it. And so there was some aspect of purification that did take place, even though we didn't intentionally think about it like that. But, what we can purify negative karmas that we engaged in, because we also try to purify negative karmas that we engaged in past lives, which we have no memory of, which wasn't really technically us. But still that negative karma is part of the mind. I mean, us in the meaning of a personal combination of this body and this mind. Still, Buddhism would say, unfortunately, we need to purify past life karma too. So in the same way, we can rejoice. And if you look at the prayers, they'll say, if you look at like FPMT's dedication prayers, they are actually kind of set up that way, where it says, all past, present, and future, positive energy, so certainly we can do it like that. We can think about rejoicing in all of our past positive actions and all of the past positive actions of every sentient being, all of, because rejoicing is a positive. So we rejoice in the bodhisattvas, we rejoice in the Buddhas, we rejoice in, all kinds of virtue, not just our own personal virtue, but that's all. You get some measure, meritoriously speaking, of rejoicing in the virtuous actions of higher beings. You share in some, not necessarily the karma of it, but the merit. There's merit in rejoicing in. So you're sort of magnetizing, you're energetically sort of magnetizing yourself toward virtue by rejoicing in the virtue of others. Doesn't mean that that virtue ripens in your own life in the same way that karma does, but the merit of it, the kind of momentum, spiritual momentum, is, you can think about, well, if a person does terrible things, you also don't get the karma of those terrible things. But if you think how wonderful that they've done terrible things, how amazing that they've done terrible things, you're magnetizing your mind to think of terrible things as something that you might want to do, that are good for people to do. So the demerit of that also works. So merit and karma are different concepts, but and certainly there's merit involved in our own karmic actions, but merit is also useful in terms of rejoicing and in terms of dedicating. Because I mean, the act of rejoicing itself is a mental karma too. It's an intentional choice. We can also choose not to rejoice. So when we choose to rejoice, we're not doing that action. We didn't teach people, we didn't build monasteries, we didn't do those actions, but we're choosing to rejoice that someone did those actions. And that choice is a mental karma, and we do get the karmic result of choosing to think about things in that way.
Thank you.
So always, we can always dedicate and we can always purify. Okay, we are done for today. So now, what do we get to do? Now we get to dedicate. So we recollect our virtuous motivation and think that we studied and listened and participated so that we could actualize that motivation, and that created positive energy in the mind. And we strongly visualize that positive energy ripening in incredibly vast beneficial ways, putting an end to all forms of suffering, installing all sentient beings in a state of perfect happiness, ripening as full enlightenment for oneself and all other sentient beings. so that sentient beings' aspiration to be free of suffering and to be happy is fulfilled, and so that our aspiration to cause that to come about is fulfilled. All right. Well, thanks for coming. And we will meet again on, so we continue with the freedoms on Thursday.